Does it make you uncomfortable, John, for me to be here?
No.
Okay.
So, when did your family come to this country?
Oh, I don't know 100% for sure. I know my general impression because it wasn't discussed a lot. I believe that the grandfathers came from Russia first without their wives and children, probably in the early 1900s.
Your grandfathers.
Both of them, maternal and paternal. And the idea was they would come and they'd earn some money and then they'd bring the women over, and sometimes they had children already. But it was never, so part of what I'm going to say is a guess. I think that I never knew either of my grandfathers. They both died before I was born, and I was born in 1945. But my mother's father, and she was the youngest in the family,
What was her last name?
Owlick, Owlick. There was her oldest sister, Beatrice, was born in Russia, that I know, and came over with the mom when she was a young girl, little, maybe a baby.
What were Reni's mom and dad's names?
So, her mother's name was Lena, Lena, and I'm not sure of the father's name. It might have been Jacob, but it might not have been. It was never real. She never really discussed the father, and I think the father wasn't a big part of her life. I think that he died maybe when she was a teenager, and there was Aunt Bee, and then there was Aunt Billy, whose name was Gertrude, and then there was Uncle Bill, and then there was my mother, who was the baby. But in between Bill and my mother, there was another daughter, Anne, who she never knew, who died of what I believe, either scarlet or rheumatic fever. I think it was rheumatic fever. But my mother never knew her. And my grandmother, that grandmother, barely spoke English. She spoke a few words of English. She mainly spoke Yiddish. And when I was a little girl, we lived in Dorchester, which was a predominantly Jewish and Irish neighborhood at that time. This is like in the, I guess, the late 40s.
You lived with Reni's mother?
Right. I was born in Cambridge, and my parents had an apartment on Magazine Street. Somehow I know that, although I don't know Magazine Street. It still exists, though. And then they rented, my grandmother had a 3-family house in Dorchester. That was very common. And she lived in the bottom floor, and we lived on the second floor, and she rented the top floor to various tenants. That was her income. And we would go, and I would see her almost daily, because we would go, there was a big porch, we'd go in and go upstairs, but we didn't like interact in any meaningful way on a daily basis, just hello. Like we didn't have regular meals with her or her with us or anything like that.
Were you fond of her?
Very fond of her. She was a wonderful woman. It didn't matter that we couldn't really communicate. She was a warm, nurturing, lovely woman.
Reni's mother?
Reni's mother. And I just can think of her as like always cooking. She was always cooking. Generally something.
A little surprising because I don't think of Reni as terribly warm and nurturing.
No, nothing like her mother. She's nothing like her mother. And I called that grandmother Nanny, and she was always taking me and Jeff aside and secretly handing us Hershey chocolate bars and dimes.
Mm-hmm.
But it was like a secret. We were supposed to take them and hide them or whatever.
Do you know why they came? Why they left Russia?
It was never discussed. It was typical of that whole generation of immigrants, and I think this is typical of immigrant communities in general. that they wanted to make a new life in America and they wanted to be as American as possible. So therefore they gave their children the most American names they could think of, even though they themselves were not fluent in English.
Mm-hmm.
And they never talked to the grandchildren about what it was like in Russia or why they had come. It was simply not a discussion. And I don't know how much they talked about it to their own children, because when I got old enough to be interested to ask, by the time I was old enough to be interested to ask, the grandmothers had died. And my mother had very little information. One time my cousin Mary from California, Aunt Billy's daughter, asked me, because they wanted to know too. And it's like, nobody from that generation talked very much about it, other than to say life was tough, that they were poor,
Mm-hmm.
that there wasn't very much money or food.
Did they talk about anti-Semitism or pogroms or anything?
No, never talked about that. What my mother talked about, because she was resentful of it, was that within her family she was the best student. She was a very good student. And my Uncle Bill, her older brother, with whom she always had a lot of conflict, was clearly the preferred child because he was the son, the only son. And the little money that they had was spent to send Uncle Bill, I think, to the University of North Carolina to college, which he either dropped out of or flunked out of after a year, when my mother would have given anything to be able to go to college, but there was no money for that. Are you okay?
So you don't know any farther back than your grandfather coming here?
No.
Do you know what part of Russia?
Well, when I used to ask, excuse me, where they came from, they said Odessa, but we never knew if it really was Odessa, because Odessa's a port, and it's a port from which many immigrants left. Actually, Odessa's in Ukraine, right, Bob?
Right.
Right. So I don't think they were from Ukraine. I think they actually were from Russia, but they would say Odessa, but I think they meant we came from that port of Odessa.
So like roughly what year, roughly, did they come?
I'd say that, I'm guessing now, that the men came in the around the turn of the century, or maybe in the 1910s, and by the 1920s they brought the women over, the wives over, and then they had more children with them in this country. So that my father's mother had 3 children, and she didn't speak any English at all. Nanny spoke a few words of English. Bubby spoke like no words of English. And Nanny and Bubby are Yiddish words. Bubby in particular is Yiddish for grandma. And she was like an old battle axe. She wasn't warm and nurturing at all, but I somehow understood that she loved me in her sort of battle axe kind of way.
So you had a warm feeling about her also?
Yes, but not as warm as about Nanny. But I used to spend a lot of time over at that grandmother's, the paternal grandmother's apartment with my Aunt Martha, who had no children. And she would let me go through her drawers. And I would spend hours going through her drawers and looking at her, trying on her jewelry and her scarves. That was entertainment for me.
Where was that apartment?
That was in Roxbury, which is famous now because that's where, not Elijah Muhammad, who's the guy that got killed, that was shot? The guy that was shot, who's the famous black leader. Malcolm X was brought up in Roxbury. Roxbury and Dorchester both, which had been places where Jewish and Irish immigrants predominantly settled. There was an influx of blacks in roughly around the mid-50s. And so the whites, the Jews, and the Irish fled from Roxbury and Dorchester. And the Jews went to Newton and Brookline, but we went to Belmont. And I don't know if the Irish did the same or if they tended to go more to other places, I'm not sure.
What was Nate's mom's real name?
So they called her Frima, Frima, and sometimes they referred to her as Frances, but Frima would have been the Yiddish name. And Rotman was the last name. But she named her children Elizabeth, Martha, and Nathan, because those were the most American names. She knew that, even though she didn't speak English.
Why didn't I ever hear of Elizabeth?
My Aunt Betty, because she was much older than my father, didn't have a close relationship with her. She, only because we didn't live nearby. She was the grandmother of my cousin Deborah Holuska, who now lives in Wellesley, Massachusetts.
I'm just gonna stop this and then restart it.